At the bustling airport, an elderly man quietly placed his bag on the security belt. Inside were medals of honor, glinting under the scanner. But when a skeptical officer stopped him, accusing him of theft, they had no idea the story behind those medals or the shocking truth that would soon be revealed. The airport buzzed with the energy of travelers rushing to make flights, announcements crackling through overhead speakers, and the hum of suitcase wheels skimming over polished floors. David Miller moved steadily through the crowd, his stride unhurried, his focus calm. At 68, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had lived many lives, his posture straight, his expression composed. Dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and neatly pressed slacks, David wore no outward indication of who he was or where he'd been. His only visible accessory was a well-worn leather satchel slung over one shoulder, containing the proof of his sacrifices, his medals. Among them was the Presidential Medal of Freedom, awarded to him just the day before in a ceremony he never imagined would include him. He had felt the president's firm handshake, heard the applause of a crowd filled with dignitaries, and yet, now, in the chaos of the airport, he was just another traveler. David adjusted the strap of his bag and joined the line for security, blending seamlessly into the crowd. As he reached the checkpoint, he handed his boarding pass and ID to the agent with a polite nod. The young woman behind the counter barely glanced at him before motioning him forward. He didn't mind the anonymity. It was something he had learned to live with long ago. He placed his satchel and suitcase onto the conveyor belt, emptying his pockets into a small tray. The system beeped steadily as items moved through the scanner. David waited, his hands clasped in front of him, until the conveyor came to an abrupt halt. A sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. "Whose bag is this?" David stepped forward, raising his hand. "It's mine." The voice belonged to a TSA officer with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes, his uniform pristine and his badge glinting under the harsh lights. "Agent Foster," the stitched name tag read. He picked up David's suitcase and set it aside with a scrutinizing look. "Step over here," Foster ordered, motioning toward a secondary screening area. David complied without protest, his movements calm and deliberate. He knew the drill. Patience was a virtue he had mastered long ago. Foster unzipped the suitcase, revealing neatly folded clothes, a pair of polished dress shoes, and a small, velvet-lined box. The officer's eyes narrowed as he opened the box, revealing its contents, a collection of medals, each shining under the fluorescent light. "What are these?" Foster asked, holding up the Presidential Medal of Freedom like it was a counterfeit bill. "Those are my medals," David replied evenly. "I received them for my service." Foster's eyes flicked to David, his expression skeptical. "Service, huh? And what kind of service gets you something like this?" David met his gaze, his voice steady but firm. "Military service. 40 years. That medal," he pointed calmly to the one in Foster's hand, "was awarded to me yesterday by the president." Foster raised an eyebrow, letting out a soft, disbelieving chuckle. "Yesterday? The president?" "Sure." David said nothing, his composure unbroken. Years of discipline had taught him that responding to provocation rarely yielded results. Foster, however, seemed intent on testing him further. "These look a little too fancy for someone flying coach," Foster remarked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. A few people in line turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. David didn't flinch. He simply watched as Foster rifled through the rest of the suitcase, pulling out more medals and ribbons, bronze stars, service crosses, and campaign badges, each representing a chapter of David's life. "Step into the side room," Foster said abruptly, motioning toward a plain door marked security screening. The room was small and sterile, with white walls and a single metal table at its center. David took a seat as instructed, his hands resting on his knees. Foster entered a moment later, followed by another TSA officer, an older man with a weary expression and a name tag reading Officer Baker. "What's going on here?" Baker asked, looking between David and Foster. Foster held up the medals. "Found these in his bag. Claims they're his. Says he got this one from the president yesterday." Baker's eyes widened as he recognized the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He hesitated, glancing at David. "Is that true, sir?" "It is," David replied simply. Baker frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Foster, maybe we should finish the inspection," Foster interrupted, his tone sharp. "Can't just take his word for it." Baker looked at David, then back at Foster. I don't think I'll handle this, Foster snapped, silencing his colleague. David watched the exchange silently, noting Baker's hesitation. It was a familiar dynamic, one man asserting dominance while the other stood by, unsure whether to intervene. David had seen it countless times, in countless forms, on countless battlefields. Outside the room, the airport's PA system crackled to life. Attention passengers, General Robert Wilson has just arrived at Gate 12. David heard the announcement and allowed himself a brief, inward smile. He had served under Wilson once, decades ago, when both of them were younger men. The general was a man of integrity, a leader who commanded respect not through fear, but through example. And now, by sheer coincidence or providence, he was here. Inside the room, Foster continued to question David, his tone growing more accusatory with each passing minute. Where's your proof? Got a certificate? A letter? Anything to back up your story? David, calm as ever, replied, I don't need to prove my service to you. The medals speak for themselves. Foster scoffed. That's not how this works. The door opened abruptly, cutting him off. A young man in a suit entered, his expression urgent. Excuse me, but General Wilson would like a word. Foster blinked, startled. Wilson? General Wilson? The man nodded. He says it's about Mr. Miller. Foster's confidence wavered for the first time, and David allowed himself the faintest trace of a smile. Reinforcements had arrived. The silence in the interrogation room was thick as David and Agent Foster stared at each other, the air between them charged. Foster's grip on the medals tightened momentarily, as if his authority were somehow bolstered by holding them. David remained seated, his hands resting on his knees, his face calm but unyielding. The man who had interrupted stood awkwardly in the doorway, adjusting his tie as he repeated his message. General Wilson is requesting to speak with Mr. Miller immediately. Foster's brow furrowed in irritation. We're in the middle of a security screening, he snapped, his voice laced with frustration. Tell him to wait. The messenger's eyes widened slightly, caught between protocol and the gravity of relaying a request from a decorated general. Sir, with respect, General Wilson doesn't wait. He was quite insistent. David observed the exchange with quiet amusement. He didn't say a word, but there was something in his steady gaze that made Foster shift uncomfortably. Baker, standing near the wall like a reluctant spectator, cleared his throat. Foster, Baker began cautiously. Maybe we should, I'll handle it. Foster interrupted, his irritation flaring. He turned to David, his tone hard. Stay here. This isn't over. Foster strode out of the room, leaving Baker and the young messenger behind. The latter glanced nervously at David before retreating to follow Foster, leaving the veteran and Baker alone. For a moment, there was silence. You served under Wilson, didn't you? Baker finally asked, his voice low and hesitant. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. A long time ago. Baker shifted awkwardly. He's one of the greats. You must have done something extraordinary to get his attention. David gave a small shrug. Just did my job. Baker fell silent, his gaze dropping to the table where the medals lay. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps recognition of his own complicity in standing by while Foster's interrogation had escalated. He started to say something but stopped himself, his words catching in his throat. Outside, the terminal was abuzz with the murmurs of travelers catching sight of General Robert Wilson. At 72, Wilson was an imposing figure, his silver hair neatly combed and his stride purposeful. His presence commanded attention, a ripple of deference following him as he made his way toward the security checkpoint. Foster met him halfway, his steps slowing as he approached. General Wilson, Foster said, attempting to sound authoritative but failing to hide the nervous edge in his voice. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we're conducting a routine screening. Routine. Wilson's voice cut through Foster's explanation like a blade. Detaining a man like David Miller over his medals is what you call routine. Foster's mouth opened and closed, no words forming. Wilson stepped closer, his steel blue eyes narrowing. Do you even know who that man is? Foster stammered. He claimed? Wilson's tone turned icy. He doesn't need to claim anything. David Miller is one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. I've seen him risk his life for his comrades, save civilians under fire, and carry out missions most men wouldn't dare attempt. And you're questioning his honor. The sharp reprimand drew the attention of nearby travelers and airport staff, all now watching the confrontation unfold. Foster's face turned crimson, his composure unraveling under Wilson's gaze. "Sir, we were just following protocol. Don't insult me by hiding behind protocol," Wilson snapped. "You've insulted a hero, and you've embarrassed yourself in the process." Back in the interrogation room, the door swung open with a sharp creak, and Wilson entered, his presence filling the small space. David rose slowly, his expression softening at the sight of his former commander. "David," Wilson said, his voice warmer now, "I'm sorry you had to endure this nonsense." "No need to apologize, sir," David replied, clasping Wilson's outstretched hand. "I've faced worse." Wilson gave a small, rueful smile. "I'm sure you have, but that doesn't make this acceptable." He turned to Baker, who was standing stiffly against the wall, and gestured toward the medals on the table. "Did you question these two?" Baker shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I knew what they were." "Then why didn't you stop this?" Wilson's question was pointed but calm, his eyes locking on Baker. Baker swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "I should have." Wilson nodded once, as if accepting the admission. Then, he turned to Foster, who had followed him into the room, his expression sullen and defensive. "Foster," Wilson began, his voice steady but firm. "Do you know what the Presidential Medal of Freedom represents? It's not just a piece of metal. It's a recognition of extraordinary contributions to this country, and yet you treated it, and its recipient, as if they were counterfeit." Foster fumbled for a response, but found none. Wilson's words landed with the weight of an artillery shell, leaving no room for rebuttal. As the tension in the room thickened, the door opened again, and the airport manager, Mr. Kevin, entered. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. "General Wilson," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I assure you, we are handling this matter appropriately." Wilson turned to him, his expression hard. "Appropriately? You call this appropriate?" Kevin stammered. "We have procedures in place, sir, and sometimes," Wilson raised a hand to silence him, "sometimes you use common sense. This isn't just about procedures. It's about respect for a man who has given more to this country than any of us in this room combined." Kevin nodded hastily, his eyes darting to Foster. "I'll see to it that this doesn't happen again." Wilson's gaze lingered on Kevin for a moment before returning to David. "Come on, David, let's get you out of here." As they left the room, the eyes of staff and passengers alike followed them, the weight of what had transpired sinking in. For David, it wasn't the humiliation of being questioned that lingered. It was the reminder of how far there was still to go. The terminal was alive with the murmur of travelers, but for David Miller, the noise faded into the background as he walked beside General Robert Wilson. Each step they took seemed to carry the weight of the confrontation behind them, yet David's posture remained calm, his expression steady. He had learned long ago not to let indignities leave permanent marks. Wilson, however, was far from calm. His steel blue eyes flashed with restrained anger as he guided David toward the airport lounge. They passed a cluster of onlookers, their whispers a mix of curiosity and unease. David noticed the way some passengers averted their gazes, others nodding subtly in recognition of his dignity. When they reached a quiet corner of the lounge, Wilson gestured for David to sit. "You're too gracious, David," he said, his voice tight with frustration. That wasn't just disrespect, it was disgraceful. David gave a small shrug. "I've been through worse, sir. I pick my battles." Wilson leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table between them. "But you shouldn't have to pick this one. What they did wasn't just ignorance. It was malice, and malice needs to be confronted." David smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You've always been more fiery than me, General." Wilson sat back, his jaw tightening. "It's not fire, David. It's anger, and it's justified." Agent Foster sat in the interrogation room alone, his confidence shaken. The confrontation with Wilson replayed in his mind, each word from the general cutting deeper than the last. Foster drummed his fingers on the metal table, a habit born of impatience and frustration. The door creaked open, and Officer Baker stepped in, his expression heavy with unease. He shut the door softly behind him and leaned against the wall. "Foster," Baker began, his voice low, "you crossed the line back there." Foster's eyes snapped to his colleague. "Don't start with me, Baker. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Baker's voice hardened. "Your job isn't to humiliate people. That man, David Miller, he's a hero, and you treated him like a criminal. Foster's jaw clenched. How was I supposed to know? He didn't exactly show up with a sign around his neck. Baker shook his head, exhaling sharply. You didn't want to know. You saw an older black man with a bag full of medals and decided he couldn't possibly have earned them. Don't act like this was protocol. It was prejudice. The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. Foster looked away, his fingers still drumming, now faster, more erratic. Maybe I was wrong, he muttered finally. But it's done now. Baker's eyes narrowed. No, it's not. Wilson isn't going to let this slide, and neither should you. Wilson pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. David raised an eyebrow. What are you doing now? Calling in reinforcements. Wilson replied curtly. I'm not letting this go unchecked. People like Foster need to be held accountable, and so does that manager, Kevin. This isn't just about you, David. It's about everyone who's been treated like this and didn't have someone to back them up. David sighed, leaning back in his chair. It's a noble fight, Robert, but it's exhausting. Wilson glanced up, his gaze softening. You shouldn't have to fight it alone anymore. Before they could continue their conversation, a uniformed airport employee approached, her face pale and apprehensive. General Wilson, Mr. Miller. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said hesitantly, but the airport director would like to meet with you both. David exchanged a glance with Wilson, whose expression darkened. Let's hear what they have to say, Wilson said, rising to his feet. The director's office was a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the interrogation room. Plush carpeting muffled their footsteps, and framed photographs of aviation milestones lined the walls. Director Susan Shaw, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, stood as they entered, her expression a mix of contrition and composure. Mr. Miller, General Wilson, she began, extending a hand to each of them. Let me start by saying how deeply sorry I am for what happened today. It was unacceptable. Wilson didn't mince words. It wasn't just unacceptable. It was disgraceful. Your staff disrespected a man who's given more to this country than any of us can comprehend. Shaw nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. I agree completely, and I want to assure you that steps are already being taken to address the situation. David, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. What steps exactly? Shaw hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. Agent Foster has been placed on immediate suspension, pending a full review. Officer Baker has submitted a formal statement about the incident, and Manager Kevin has been removed from his post. Wilson crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. That's a start, but it's not enough. Agreed, Shaw said quickly. We're implementing mandatory training for all security staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity and respect for veterans. We're also creating a program to recruit and support veterans within the airport workforce. Mr. Miller, I'd like to invite you to consult on its development. David tilted his head slightly, considering her words. That's unexpected. Shaw offered a faint smile. It's the least we can do. Your dignity in the face of such mistreatment is something we can all learn from. The fallout from the incident spread quickly. Foster's suspension turned into a permanent dismissal after the internal review revealed a pattern of similar complaints. Kevin's removal became public knowledge within the airport community, his replacement chosen for their commitment to equity and respect. Baker, moved by the events, took it upon himself to reach out to David directly, apologizing for his silence. I should have spoken up sooner, Baker admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I'll carry that failure with me. David, ever gracious, replied. It's not about the mistakes you've made. It's about what you do next. Weeks later, David stood before a room filled with airport staff during the inaugural Veterans Appreciation Day, sharing his story with quiet strength. The audience listened intently, their expressions ranging from remorse to admiration. Even Foster, seated in the back under an assumed name, couldn't help but feel the weight of David's words. Respect isn't just given, David said. It's earned through action, through understanding, and through the courage to do what's right, even when it's hard. The applause that followed wasn't just for David. It was for the change he had inspired, one quiet act of resilience at a time. The aftermath of the airport incident was like a stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples far beyond the security checkpoint where it had begun. For David Miller, the days following were a mixture of reflection and cautious hope. He had faced many battles in his life, but this one felt different, not because it was the hardest, but because of what it represented. This wasn't just about his dignity. It was about the countless others who might never have a voice to fight back. One morning, as David sat on his porch, nursing a cup of coffee, a sleek black sedan pulled up in front of his modest home. The driver stepped out and opened the back door, revealing Director Susan Shaw. She approached with a confident stride, holding a leather-bound portfolio under her arm. "Mr. Miller," Shaw greeted, her voice professional but warm. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." David rose from his chair, shaking her hand firmly. "Director Shaw, I wasn't expecting a house call. I wanted to speak with you personally," Shaw replied, taking a seat in the chair he offered. "After everything that happened, I realized we needed to do more than just apologize. We need to act." David gestured toward her portfolio. "And I'm guessing that's why you're here." Shaw nodded, placing the portfolio on the table and opening it. Inside were documents outlining a new initiative, a veterans advocacy program designed to provide employment opportunities, sensitivity training, and resources for those who had served. "We're calling it the Miller Initiative," Shaw explained, sliding the documents toward him, "in honor of what you've endured and what you've achieved." David stared at the papers, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he said, "I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need my name on anything. This isn't about me." "Exactly," Shaw replied, her gaze steady. "It's about what you stand for. This initiative will help ensure that no veteran goes through what you did, and I can't think of a better name to inspire that mission." David leaned back in his chair, considering her words. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right, but only if this program truly delivers on its promises." Shaw smiled. "It will, and I'd like you to help us make sure of that." Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, Foster sat at his kitchen table, staring at the termination letter he had received weeks earlier. His dismissal from the TSA had hit him hard, not just financially, but emotionally. For the first time, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. He had replayed the incident in his mind countless times, each recollection revealing a new layer of his own arrogance and prejudice. The memory of General Wilson's words stung the most. "Do you even know who that man is?" Foster hadn't known, but now he couldn't stop thinking about it. Unable to bear the weight of his guilt any longer, Foster searched for David's address. It wasn't hard to find. Heroes tended to leave footprints. Clutching a small box in his hands, he drove to David's home, rehearsing what he would say. David was surprised to hear a knock at his door that afternoon. When he opened it, he found Foster standing there, looking sheepish and uncomfortable. In his hands was a plain wooden box. "Mr. Miller," Foster began, his voice shaky. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I needed to come here to apologize." David studied him for a long moment, his expression calm but unreadable. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside. Foster entered the modest living room, his eyes briefly scanning the photographs on the walls, images of David in his younger years, surrounded by his family and fellow soldiers. He sat down awkwardly on the edge of the couch, holding the box tightly in his lap. "I was wrong," Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about everything. I treated you with disrespect and suspicion when I should have shown gratitude and honor. I've spent every day since trying to figure out how to make it right." He placed the box on the coffee table and slid it toward David. "This isn't much, but I thought maybe it could start to show how sorry I am." David opened the box to find a carefully crafted wooden plaque. It bore an engraving of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, along with the words, "For David Miller, a man of honor, courage, and resilience." David looked at Foster, his expression softening. "You didn't have to do this." "I did," Foster insisted, "because you deserve more than an apology. You deserve respect." David nodded slowly, setting the plaque aside. "Words and gestures are a start, Foster, but the real test is what you do from here." "I'll prove it," Foster said, his voice resolute. "I'll find a way to honor people like you to honor the truth." A few weeks later, David found himself standing before a packed room at the airport's inaugural Veterans Appreciation Day. The crowd included airport staff, community leaders, and travelers who had come to hear his story. At the back of the room, Foster stood quietly, his face a mix of nervousness and determination. As David stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. He glanced at the audience, then began to speak. "Respect isn't just something we owe veterans," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's something we owe each other, Because respect is the foundation of dignity, and dignity is what makes us human. He paused, letting the words sink in. I didn't ask for what happened at this airport, but I'm grateful for what's come of it. Change doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we choose to make it happen. The applause that followed was thunderous, and as David stepped down from the podium, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for every veteran, every individual who had ever been dismissed or disrespected. That evening, as David sat on his porch, the wooden plaque from Foster resting on the small table beside him, he watched the sunset over the horizon. His granddaughter, Sarah, joined him, her bright eyes filled with admiration. "Grandpa," she said softly, "you're a hero." David smiled, pulling her close. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a man who stood his ground." The ripples of his actions continued to spread, touching lives he would never meet, and in the quiet of the evening, David Miller allowed himself to feel something he rarely did: pride. David Miller had never been one to seek recognition. To him, the medals, the ceremonies, and even the applause felt secondary to the purpose that had driven his life: service. But the events at the airport, and their aftermath, had placed him in a spotlight he had not asked for. Now, that spotlight seemed to follow him everywhere. The morning after Veterans Appreciation Day, David was sipping his usual black coffee on the porch when the mail arrived. Amid the bills and circulars was a large envelope embossed with the seal of the United States. He turned it over in his hands, the weight of it heavier than it seemed. Inside was a letter, handwritten on fine stationery. "Dear Mr. Miller, I recently learned about the ordeal you faced at the airport and the grace with which you handled it. It is a reminder of why you were chosen to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, not just for what you have done, but for who you are. Your dignity and strength in the face of injustice have inspired not only me, but countless others across the nation. I want you to know that your story is already leading to change. I am directing my administration to expand programs supporting veterans and to work with organizations like the TSA to ensure respect and dignity for all who serve this country. Thank you for your service and for continuing to lead by example. With respect, the President of the United States." David read the letter twice, his hands steady but his heart unexpectedly heavy. He folded it neatly and set it on the table beside his coffee. The words were kind, but they also brought a sense of responsibility, a weight he hadn't anticipated. That afternoon, as David worked in his garden, he heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel driveway. He turned to see Officer Baker, now in plain clothes, approaching with a tentative smile. The man looked different, less burdened perhaps, or simply more at peace. "Mr. Miller," Baker greeted, stopping a few feet away. "I hope I'm not intruding." David straightened, brushing dirt off his hands. "Not at all. What brings you by?" Baker hesitated, his eyes scanning the vibrant flowers David had carefully cultivated. "I just wanted to thank you for everything." David tilted his head slightly, waiting for Baker to continue. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the incident," Baker admitted, "about how I stood by and let it happen, about what I could have done differently. It's made me realize how many times I've stayed silent when I should have spoken up." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And what have you decided to do with that realization?" Baker smiled faintly. "I've started volunteering with a local veterans organization, helping them navigate job applications, benefits, that sort of thing. It's not much, but it feels like a start." David clapped him on the shoulder, his grip firm but warm. "It's a good start, Baker. Keep at it." Later that week, David received an unexpected invitation to speak at a national summit on Veterans Affairs in Washington, D.C. The invitation came with a promise of a large audience, including policymakers, military leaders, and advocates. It was an opportunity to share his story on a grand scale, but it also came with a dilemma. David wasn't sure he wanted to relive the event so publicly. That evening, as he sat on the porch with his granddaughter, Sarah, he shared his hesitation. "I'm not a public speaker," he said. "I don't have fancy words or big ideas. I just lived my life the best I could." Sarah, wise beyond her years, placed her small hand on his. "But, Grandpa, that's exactly why people need to hear you. Because you're real, and what happened to you wasn't just about you. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." Her words echoed in his mind long after she'd gone to bed. The ballroom of the conference center in Washington was vast, its chandeliers casting a warm glow over rows of polished chairs. David stood backstage, adjusting the lapel of his jacket. General Wilson was there, offering encouragement. "When you get up there," Wilson said, "just speak from the heart. That's all you've ever needed to do." David nodded, his nerves steadying. When his name was announced, he stepped onto the stage to a round of applause. The audience rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. As he reached the podium, David scanned the crowd. Policymakers, military brass, and civilians alike watched him with rapt attention. Taking a deep breath, he began. "I'm not here to talk about myself," he said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm here to talk about respect, about the way we treat people, not just veterans, but everyone. Because how we treat the least of us says everything about who we are." He spoke about the airport incident, not with anger, but with honesty. He spoke about the quiet struggles of veterans, about the dignity they deserved but didn't always receive. And he spoke about change, not as a grand idea, but as a series of small, deliberate actions. "When you leave this room," David concluded, "I want you to ask yourself one question. What can I do to make someone's life better today? Because that's how real change happens, one choice at a time." The standing ovation that followed wasn't for the medal or the man. It was for the truth he had spoken. David returned home to find his porch overflowing with letters, messages from people across the country who had heard his story. Veterans shared their struggles, young people shared their admiration, and families shared their gratitude. One letter stood out. It was from Agent Foster, who wrote, "Mr. Miller, your words at the summit moved me in a way I can't fully explain. I've started working with a local veterans organization, and I'm learning how to confront my own biases. I can't undo the harm I caused, but I hope to make amends by ensuring no one else endures what you did. Thank you for showing me the path forward. Sincerely, Foster." David folded the letter carefully, placing it alongside the one from the president. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat quietly, feeling a profound sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but the victories, both large and small, were enough to remind him why he had chosen to stand his ground. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to everyone who believed in the power of dignity, respect, and resilience. And in that, David Miller found his purpose renewed.